Well, hello there. It's officially fall. Welcome to today's art chat. We have our fall colors going on and some fall crafts in the background there. Today's art chat's a little different. Mostly I'm going to read you a story. If you want, you can stick around for that. I'm going to read you a true story about a family from this town where I live in rural Alberta. They have been here since 1912. And I have been left with the memoirs. Is it called a memoir? Autobiography. I've been left with the autobiography of one of the matriarchs of this family. If you like gripping tales, if you like westerns, then this story is for you. May it keep you good company while you craft. Before we launch into that, let's just take a moment to appreciate fall, the changes, the crafts. If you've been up to any fall-related crafts, tell me about them in the comments below. I'll share some of what I've been up to here. I've been really into making garlands. They sound like old dry bones. Yeah, garlands of orange slices and rose hips. I just think they're really pretty. I tie them in the windows. They catch the light. I like them. They're kind of primitive. Just plain old rose hips. I'm trying out mountain ash. It grows in our backyard. Hair. Yeah, I just love the rich red color. I don't know what they'll dry like. We'll see. While I was out gathering these rose hips, I went to a nearby newly minted provincial park called Antelope Hills. And I was out on a hike. I was staying out of the coulees because I've been told by a local hunter that there will probably be moose in them, especially in spring and fall. Fall is the male moose's rut. Well, I had an encounter with one. I surprised some grouse. Why were the birds comfortable, felt safe there? Then I came around the edge of this particular clutch of trees or coulee, and there was a giant male moose not far from me. He did not look pleased. I've never encountered a moose before. I don't know moose etiquette. I just kept walking and tried to think like a deer. Like, deer don't care about moose, probably. I'll just keep walking in a different direction. And I proceeded to my car, a little shaken, honestly. That moose was huge. However, that encounter pales in comparison to the stories I'm about to share with you from this autobiography. I hope you enjoy. Welcome. We are about a week into the future here, and I'm finally sitting down to record this. I just wanted to mention that I am going to remove a few names from this document because many of the people mentioned herein still reside in this area. Rather, their relatives reside in this area. Many of the families became well established and never left. Additionally, it's worth noting that the first few pages of this document start off a little slowly as the teller works to establish place and time. With that, let's begin. Memoirs of Beulah W. With the encouragement of my grandchildren, I'm attempting to write the history of my life and family as I remember or was told by my parents. I was born in Dodge City, Kansas, September 22nd, 1912. Came to Canada when I was a year old. Times were tough in Kansas, and the Canadian government was advertising posters and pamphlets. A free land being offered to anyone who would come with a few restrictions. They spoke in glowing terms of freedom, fertile soil and bumper crops, and no conscription or army draft. They wanted to colonize the Canadian West. They omitted telling of the extreme climate, the isolation, and the hardships of the land. All this appealed to Dad, so with a canvas-covered wagon and a team of horses, they set out for Alberta. Our family then consisted of Mother, Dad, my older sister, and myself. Our destination was Calgary, where the land office was located. The going was very slow and tedious. We finally arrived in Alberta, where we spent the first winter. There, my parents worked until spring, mostly for milk and vegetables as salary. When the spring arrived and the weather got warmer, they loaded up again and started on their way, finally arriving in Calgary, where Dad had to file for homestead rights. Application had to be made in person, where they could look at a map and see the land that was still available. By this time, a lot of the land had been taken. The homesteaders had to be British subjects, or declare they would become one before they received the land title. They were allowed 160 acres and had to sign up to live on the land for 3 years, build a house, and cultivate at least 50 acres a year for 3 years. Alberta became a province in 1905. The CPR played a big part in the settling of Western Canada. By the time they arrived in Alberta, the land had been surveyed. Townships and road allowances, etc., had all been set out, or at least on paper. The surveyor marked the northeast corner of every section. They drove a long metal rod with the land numbers on it into the ground so it would be easy to locate. The rods were marked with trench and 4 square holes. Road allowances were 60 feet wide and 1 mile apart, running north and south, and 2 miles apart, running east and west. Anyway, Dad decided on a place called Halliday, which was midway between Roslyn and Sunnynook. On leaving Calgary, the horses were so played out that he bought another team when we reached Dalroy. When we arrived at our farm, which was 2.5 miles west of Halliday, there was nothing but grassland. No house, no nothing, just bald-headed prairie. This was to be the promised land. My mother would have gladly returned if possible. We lived in the wagon until a sod house was built. They bought a plow. Furrows were turned. These furrows were cut into sections about 18 inches long. Like huge bricks, these were piled one on top of the other to form walls. Openings were left for a door and a small window. The roof was made by placing poles for beams, covering them with tar paper, hay, and more sod piled on top. For windows or doors, they had to drive 60 to 65 miles to Castor, this being the closest place to buy these things. The houses were cool in the summer and warm in the winter. As there was no fences at this time, the horses had to be picketed out or hobbled so that they could not get away. Picketing was much easier on the animals than the hobbles. They bought 2x4 and lumber for floors, dug a cellar under the house where cream, eggs, and vegetables, etc. were stored to keep cool. No fridges or ice boxes in those days. A ladder was built to go up and down the cellar, with a door in the kitchen floor. Later on, a barn was built in the same way. A well was dug inside the barn and a pump installed with a pipe running through the side to a trough outside to water the stock. We got lots of exercise pumping water. Most of the settlers immigrated from the U.S., a lot from South and North Dakota, Minnesota, and Kansas, some from England, Scotland, and Scandinavian countries. Coal oil lamps and lanterns were our only light. These had to be filled, the wicks trimmed, and the chimneys cleaned as they smoked a lot. No wonder we have wrinkles from squinting so much. We had no conveniences, only outdoor plumbing. A toilet in the backyard made of wood with 2 holes cut to sit on, one large and one small. In the cold, frosty weather, you did not tarry long. The old Eaton's catalog used as toilet paper. It served 2 purposes as each page was scanned. It was the only way we could buy most things. Running water was still unheard of. We carried water to the house in pails, heated it on a 4-burner stove. To have a bath, we heated it in the boiler, then transferred it to the big tub, which was placed in the middle of the kitchen floor. The youngest bathed first, and so on, adding more hot water each time to keep the bath warm. After, the tub was hung outside the house, as there was no room inside. For washing clothes, the water was heated the same way. We used a scrub board by hand to get the clothes clean. A lot of our clothes were made from bleached flour sacks. To iron, we had some old sand irons that were heated on the stove. When we first arrived, paper was scarce. So we gathered dry grass to start the fire and burning buffalo chips. These were dried out old cow pads, which we gathered in a gunny sack. Coal had to be hauled from Sheerness at $2 per ton. The railroad was here before we arrived. There was a small train depot and platform, a blacksmith shop. The train ran twice a week, started in Hanna, and went as far as South Wardlow. In those days, it was called the Beevine. The train had a passenger car and a freight car that carried mostly eggs and cream in cans, usually 5 gallons. Sometimes the train had grain car and a mail car. Prior to this, we got mail once a week delivered by wagon or sleigh or horseback. Then Holiday got a grain elevator, which was necessary for the farmers to ship their grain. Finally, we got a school, but not for a few years later. Holiday never did grow much. Finally, it disappeared altogether. Holiday was located north of Sunnynook on the west side of the road. A few years after acquiring the homestead, the government offered more free land. This was known as script land, originally offered only to the veterans of the Boer War. Of course, Dad applied and was granted another 160 acres. A certificate was issued which entitled the holder to locate and possess a tract of public land. They paid a small amount of money for same. I think it was $50. This land was located 12 miles west of our homestead, a place called Normandale. It was 5 miles from Frazenton. Here we built a one-room house to start with. It was made of lumber, but the barn was made of sod, same way as at Halliday. They dug a cellar under the house with a ladder to climb up and down. They also dug a well and curbed it with wood so the sides would not cave in. We had a rope tied to a pail and a pulley fashioned to some 2x4. We pulled the rope hand over hand to fetch water. I don't remember this ever changing while we lived in the home. In time, they built dams and dugouts to hold water that ran off in the spring. They reinforced them with rocks that were hauled by stone boat. This way, the stock always had water to drink. The first few years, the crops yielded well, and they bought more horses, cows, chickens, etc. Every cent went back into the farm, and of course, more machinery was bought. It took stamina and courage to turn this virgin land into the way it is today. My mother bore all the burdens of an early frontier life. She worked the land like a man. My parents were both hard workers. Mother was an excellent cook, especially with what she had to do with. My sister, in later years, not too shabby either. My mother always made wonderful bread and buns. I can shut my eyes and think I can smell the aroma of her baking. Dad bought another 160 acres near both farms. Most of this was used as pasture. Now we owned a half section at each farm. As there was no school in Halliday, but there was in Normandale, the only way for my sister, who was 6 years older, and I to get our education was to live at Normandale. So while our folks farmed at the homestead, Clara and myself lived in the summer alone at Normandale. The school was 1.5 miles by road, but only 1 mile if we cut across the pasture. We walked to school every day, but we all lived together in the winter. Mother brought bread and supplies to us every week or so. To accomplish all this, it meant moving from one farm to the other in the late fall and again in the spring. At times we were lonely and scared at night as the coyotes howled around the house. Although we lived alone, we still had work to do. We milked a couple of cows and had pigs to feed. Water was scarce, and we had 10 head of cattle, which had to be driven to the pond about 1 mile away each day to have a drink. I shall never forget my first day at school. I was only 5 years old. Mr. C, our teacher, brought me some plasticine to mold. Then he came and took it away and gave me some blocks, which didn't interest me. Then he took them away and brought me some sticks, which were boring. So I put my head on the desk and went to sleep. So he woke me up, and I looked at him and said, "Please go away, don't bother me." I made him angry, and he grabbed and shook me roughly. I was afraid of him after this. Anyways, I never slept at school again. He only taught 1 year. A few years later, we went to the neighbor's auction sale. As I was wandering around, someone tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Please go away, don't bother me." I looked up at him and said, "You must be Mr. C." We had a good laugh, and all tension was gone. I always was shy and backwards, which was brought on by us two living alone. Our school was used for everything: community gatherings, dances, meetings, church, you name it. It was all done in the school. There was a lot of rangeland where everybody let their horses fend for themselves in the winter. This is why the horses had to be branded, so they knew who they belonged to in the spring roundup. I hated to see these poor horses branded. A fire was built, and irons were heated to red white. The horses were thrown, and they stuck these hot irons on them, burning the hair away and into the skin. All the farmers had a different brand and were registered. It also stopped a lot of horse thieves. Man became the horse's dreaded enemy as they felt the sharp knife and hot irons. I always felt sick for days after this. I never wanted any animal to suffer. Another thing I couldn't stand was killing the animals for food when the day before I had thought of them as friends and pets. I wouldn't eat meat for a week or two after. I could have easily become a vegetarian. The winters were severe. The whole universe was much colder then. The winters were desperately cold. We felt the sting of storms, wind, rain, snow, and sleet. Hardships and danger were known to all those pioneers. But perseverance was the backbone of these early settlers. We dreaded winters and longed for summer to feel the warmth of the sun again. Spring brought new hope, new life, and pretty flowers. Summer was not always kind either. Sometimes the sun became our enemy. It parched the land in times of drought and heat. There were so many drawbacks. World War I broke out in 1914. Huge tracts of land were turned under to assist in the war effort. Wheat was the motto, and the economy boomed. Heavy rainfalls in 1915 produced bumper crops, and prices were high. Wells were dug, and new and better equipment was purchased. The war was over in 1918. Fortunately, we got a lot of needed new things for the house and new clothes and shoes, all bought from the Eaton's catalog. Unfortunately, prosperity did not last. The bottom fell out of the cattle market and wheat prices fell. The end of Prohibition came in 1923. More favorable weather conditions and better prices returned. The pioneer days were about over. One of our neighbors at Normandale decided to call it quits and move away. My folks bought up their 4-room house. We thought we had a palace compared to what we had been used to before. This made living a lot more pleasant for Mother. We even got a radio, listened mostly with headphones, and it had a horn. Gas lamps and lanterns replaced the coal oil. By this time, Hannah had become quite a little town. I recall one time at Halliday, Dad and I went by sleigh and teamed to town for supplies. On our way back home, a pack of coyotes attacked us. They were hungry and vicious. They kept jumping at the horses' tummies. Dad had a black snake whip and kept lashing at them. He raced the horses, but to no avail. Dad told me to throw some groceries out and try to delay the attack. One package I threw out was a roast beef. They fought over this for a while. So I kept on throwing everything out. We finally arrived home, where Dad had just enough time to dash into the house and get the shotgun. After firing a few shots, they disappeared. After that, we never left home without the gun. Through all the hard times, we never went hungry. Mother was a good shot, with either the rifle or the shotgun. She shot a lot of rabbits. We ate a lot of rabbit stew. She also shot ducks and prairie chickens. We planted our own potatoes and vegetables. Remember having lots of horseradish, which had to be ground. For fruit, we had mostly rhubarb and saskatoons, which we picked in coulees a few miles from our farm. There was a pond behind our buildings at Halliday. Grain grew all the way around it. In the fall, it was cut and stooked. I remember Mother grabbing the shotgun one morning and hiding behind a stook close to the pond. With one shot, she got 7 ducks. So you can guess what we were having for a few days. We also grew a lot of rutabaga. We ate some and chopped the rest up to feed the cows and pigs. May 5th, 1917. I had been sent out of the house to play. I knew Mother had company, and I didn't want to bother them. Sometime later, Miss C, a neighbor lady, called me and said, "Come see what I've got." I got close to her and saw she was holding something in her arms. That was my baby brother. I thought he was a doll, and I wanted to play with him. Miss C acted as midwife in Normandale. There were no doctors or hospitals in those days. Thank God we have them now. The baby was named Vernon. I really loved him. He was so cute with a little rosebud mouth. Even when he grew up, I always protected him. One day, a tragedy happened 5 miles from our place. Mr. F, who ran the post office and a small store, was murdered. He was found under some coal in his basement after some neighbors became suspicious. Rumors ran wild. It was announced in school that the suspect, his hired man, was hiding in the cellars of vacant places. As we were in school all day, we were afraid to go into the house after school. We had no locks on our door or windows. Clara said, "Let's not go into the house tonight. Let's walk to Mother and Dad's place, and we won't come back without them." So we milked the cows and fed the milk to the pigs, fed the chickens, and walked the 12 miles to the homestead. I thought we walked all night. It was dark and a few stars and the coyotes howling. Our folks were sure surprised. The next morning, with a horse and buggy, Mother took us back and stayed with us. We never stayed alone after this. The hired man was later discovered and confessed to the murder. No one in our family ever sat around idle. Dad always worked very hard. In fact, too hard. He never had time to socialize. Dad taught me how to run all the machinery on the farm. I ran every piece from plow, harrow, cultivator, discs, and seed drill. The only thing I never attempted was the binder. I mowed and raked the hay. Then he taught me how to stook the grain. I harnessed the horses and helped to unhitch them. Dad always said that I was the best hired man he ever had. Don't remember being paid for the work, but enjoyed doing it. My mother got out a horse and saddle. The horse used to buck my mother and sister off as often as she could. This horse eventually became mine. She was a bay, and we called her Babe. She was very high-spirited. She only threw me once, and she didn't mean to. I was sitting on her side saddle when she shied at a piece of paper on the side of the road. Next thing I knew, I was sitting on the ground. She nudged me with her nose for me to get up. No one would believe this, as she used to buck my mother and sister off all the time. I became an excellent rider and would ride any horse on the farm, whether they were broke or unbroke. I loved all animals and still do, from horses, little colts, cows, calves, and right down to the fluffy little chicks and fuzzy ducks. In 1917, we had a bumper crop, but 1918 was a complete crop failure. There were so many drawbacks. We had lots of rain. The mosquitoes were unbearable to man and beast. We had to build smudges so the horses and cows could stand in the corrals. The smudges kept some of the mosquitoes away, but we had to stay up all night to keep them going. Otherwise, the animals would stampede. When it was dry, the grasshoppers would take over the crops. Flying ants would eat you alive, and the horseflies had to be battled. One time, when Clara and I were at Halliday, and Mother and Dad had gone to the script land, we saw a peddler coming in his small covered wagon pulled by horses. As we never trusted him, we hid in the cellar. He went from farm to farm selling salt, spices, soap, liniment, and salve. Mother would quite often give him dinner, so he made sure that he always arrived around mealtime. We didn't trust the peddler because he was always trying to get close to us, and this gave us the creeps. Anyways, the peddler arrived. He must have had an idea where we were hiding. As he opened the cellar door, Claire said, "Don't you come down here," but he kept coming down. We had a large dishpan full of eggs and another pan full of ripe tomatoes. Claire grabbed some eggs and started peppering him. I joined in, quite gleefully, to think that I could take part and help out. Well, we were strong from all our hard work, so we both kept firing away, and we didn't miss. As he was backing up, he swore at us. Every step he took, he became a dripping mess of yellow and red, but we never did stop. We emptied both pans at him and followed him out to the road. After this, we never saw him again. By the way, our closest neighbor was 3/4 of a mile away. Next summer, we moved to the homestead. One day, we went to a baseball game at Sunnynook. There, Clara met Harry while he was playing ball. Guess it was love at first sight, as she never went out with anybody but him after this. They got married when she was only 16 years old. I was broken-hearted at the thought of losing my sister. I got over being sad, although I felt the loss of my sister very much. But time heals all things. Once, in the late fall, we were moving back to the script. Vernon and I each had a horse, and we were to drive 20 head of cattle and 2 colts. The cows were slow and the colts fast and hard to control. I had my horse Babe, and he had a slower horse. He kept begging me to trade horses. Finally, I told him that I would, but to be sure to hold on to Babe's reins tight. Well, he dropped them, and she took off with the colts. Mother and Dad said they'd follow us in the bobsled. They had a coal oil stove and things to eat. I did not know what to do, so I told Vernon to walk behind the cows, and our folks would soon catch up. I took the poor old horse and tried to catch up with the others. The horses went south, and we were supposed to go west. It was a lost cause, as the horse I was riding played out. The snowbanks were up to her belly. She finally stopped, and I would not take another step. I was so cold and worried about Vernon, so I sat in the snowbank to rest her. I do remember feeling warmer. I did not realize that when you are freezing, you feel warmer. I do remember looking back at the road where I'd come from, vaguely seeing a black speck in the distance. Well, that speck turned out to be Mother and Dad in the sleigh, and it picked up Vernon. They found me in the snowbank with the horses, reins tucked under my arm, and I was asleep. They picked me up and took me to the neighbor's house, a bachelor, Mr. M. They rubbed my hands and arms with snow, trying to thaw me out. I stayed all night at his house. Well, I'll never forget the pain, and of course could not sleep, but the old man was kind and tried to help. In the meantime, a terrible blizzard blew in. The cows stampeded. My folks were trying to round them up. Sometime the next day, they came and picked me up, after they had the cattle under control. So with sore hands and all, I rode that old horse and guided the cattle. I remember arriving at Miss H's house, cold and hungry. She gave me chocolate milk and a couple of cookies, for which I was grateful. She looked at my hands and just shook her head. We finally arrived at the scrip, cows and all. I was so happy that Vernon was safe and sound. But what hands and feet I had. Freezing is like a burn. It just goes deeper and deeper. I do not know how they got in contact with the doctor, as we had no phones. Anyways, in the mail came this medicated wax, which had to be melted. I would stick my hands into it. This sealed the air away and wasn't so painful. The wax had to be changed daily, I think. I lost all my fingernails and most of my toenails. However, God was good to me, and they grew back eventually. I know that I was a very lucky girl. We didn't see the horses until next spring. The only thing left of the saddle was the cinch around Babe's tummy. One year we had poor crops. Everything was parched and dried up. What was left, the grasshoppers took. So Dad went back to Kansas to harvest corn to make some money to get by on. At that time, the rest of us lived at the homestead. Mother went to the other farm to get the wagon that the discs were loaded in. On the way home, she met a goat. Horses can't stand the smell of goats. The horses reared in the air and almost upset the wagon, but it swung backward and hit Mother in the arm and broke it in 3 places. The neighbors took her to the closest village, where there was the one and only doctor. He settled. She was away for 2 to 3 weeks. In the meantime, Vernon and I were left alone. His hands were not strong enough to milk the cows, so I milked 22 cows, both morning and night, and did all the other chores. By this time, we had a Democrat and a buggy. We had a cream separator, and, of course, this had to be washed and scalded with boiling water. We separated the cream from the milk. The cream was put into 5-gallon cans, gathered the eggs, and took them to Halliday in the buggy. The cream was shipped to Hannah. The store took the eggs in trade for groceries. We got 10 cents a dozen for the eggs. I forget the price of cream, but it wasn't very much. But us kids made out all right. We didn't have a cent of money, but we bought a few groceries and coal oil for the lamps. We were really happy when Mother got home. Her arm healed, but it was never straight again. Somewhere between 1921 and 1923, a terrible blizzard swept over the prairies. We lost 23 head of cattle and 3 horses in the storm. Many cattle were frozen solid against the barbed wire fence. Some were not quite dead. Dad got them on the stone boat and moved them back to the barn. The poor creatures suffered terribly. Some that survived lost their hooves. They should have been shot and put out of their misery. In another one of these blizzards, Dad had gone to Hannah for supplies. The storm was so bad, visibility was only 3 feet. Mother tied binder twine on the doorknob and on our arms. With shovels, we tried to remove the snow away from the barn door to put the calves in the barn. We tried for an hour and a half but couldn't make a dent in the banks that covered the door. The snow just kept swirling in faster than we could move it. The cattle stampeded and we couldn't see where they went. Later in the day, I heard a noise at the door. I told Mother, "That's a calf. I'm going to go bring it in the house." I opened the door and Dad fell in. We thought he was safe in Hannah. He was just about frozen to death. He had come home in the storm. He was in the cutter and knew the horses could not find the way to the house, so he unhitched them and took off the harnesses and turned them loose. Then he followed the fence with his hands as he did not know what direction he was going. This is when he fell against the house, and I thought it was an animal. His face and hands were frozen, and his shoes frozen to his feet. He almost lost both feet, as gangrene had set in. One of the neighbors took him back to Hannah, where he stayed in the hospital for 28 days. He finally got better and could walk again. Several people and animals lost their lives in that storm. As things built up inside me, I said, as soon as I can, I will leave this farm. Surely there is something better than this. Grade 9 was as far as they taught in country schools. If I was to further my education, I would have to go to Hannah, and my parents could not afford the extra expense, so I just passed into grade 10. When I was 15, I was hired by a neighbor to stook grain. I needed the money to buy clothes if I was going to Hannah. I stooked 160 acres of wheat for Gordon C. This was after I'd stooked 160 acres for Dad. Then I stooked 160 acres for Sheldon C. And on to Howard C., where I stooked 160 acres of wheat and 40 acres of oats. These men were all brothers. The wheat wasn't that bad, but the oats were so heavy it nearly stumped me. The sheaves were taller than me. I might add that I only weighed 90 to 95 pounds. For my effort, I received $3.50 a day. The hired men in the field received $5 a day. My stooks stood up in the windy weather, and the hired men's all blew down. The C brothers, even in later years, always bragged about this. But they never offered me any more money. I worked long and hard hours and made enough money to buy clothes to come to Hannah to work. Believe me, I did not have any experience except for farm work, so this was goodbye farm, hello town. I went to work for Mr. and Mrs. M doing housework. She showed me what to do, and I did my best for her. They had a little girl, Betty, that was 2 or 3 years old. She was a holy terror. If she didn't get her way, she would throw herself on the floor or the street, kicking and screaming in a tantrum. I had to be up at 6 in the morning, make porridge, which had to be cooked in a double boiler for an hour each morning, then feed the child and make breakfast for the other 2, make the beds, do the dishes, and whatever else needed doing. I had a nice bedroom for myself. This family owned a jewelry shop downtown. I prepared lunch and the evening meal, but they decided that I did not have enough to do, so Mrs. M asked me to work at the shop from 2 to 5 in the afternoon. I cleaned the jewelry and the silver things in the store. I liked this as I got out of the house. Mr. M was an avid hunter, brought home lots of ducks and geese. I had to pick all the feathers out of the birds. Sometimes I picked till 2 in the morning. I did not get much sleep, but never sat around. I was paid $25 per month. 16 days before I quit, she had another baby. As she had not time to go to the hospital, it was delivered in bed. A doctor that lived across the street was there. A nurse from Calgary arrived to look after them. I was so dumb, I didn't even know she was pregnant. I thought babies were delivered by a stork or found in a cabbage patch. You would think that coming from a farm, I would know all about these things by watching the animals. But I only thought animals did those things. What a shock I got. Anyways, I was washing the bedclothes after the baby was born, and the nurse called me aside and said, "You shouldn't have to do this." She said she was dumbfounded by all the work I had to do. She advised me to look for another job. The nurse was very kind to me. which was more than Mrs. M ever was to her. She accused the nurse of pinching the baby when it cried and said nasty things to her. One day I took Betty for a walk and saw a sign at the Liberty Cafe window, "Help Wanted." I went in and told them that I didn't have any experience but was willing to learn. I also told them that I needed to give my employer notice. They agreed and said come as soon as I could. I went home and told her that I was leaving at the end of the month. She flew into a rage and said I could get out right then and there. She said she wouldn't pay me. I packed and went down to see Mr. M. I told him what had happened. He was a lot more friendly. He said, "Come here, I will pay you to the end of the month." He gave me $25 and an onyx ring to remember him by. I thanked him and told him I didn't know what to expect, as it was the first work I had done in town. He said he realized she wasn't the easiest person to work for. About a week before this, Mother and Vernon had moved to Hannah also. She rented a 4-bedroom house on 7th Avenue. I kept asking Dad about being all alone, and was told that this was the way things had to be. There wasn't any money coming in from the farm, and farmers were all leaving, selling what they could. Each year the rainfall lessened, resulting in small yields and skimpy grass for the cattle. All this led to depression years and the terrible dust storms, which got worse every year. Mom took in room and boarders to make a living. I went to work at the Liberty Cafe right away. Helped out at home with money I made. As I said, terrible drought came, and unbelievable depression hit more and more. The best way I can describe it is by the following verse. When drought came, disbelieving farmers watched, and more every day saw their prairie like a maiden stricken, wasting fast away. Then the wind came, howling, lashing like a fiend the devil sent, like a giant black fury. It ripped and roared on destruction bent. It lifted soil from bare fields, parching, filled the air with dirt and sand. Beat her, lashed her with no mercy, languid, helpless, helpless land. In 1931, the government of Alberta offered the residents of this stricken area free transportation for families and effects to any point in Alberta. Most people bade a sad farewell to this beloved prairie and moved elsewhere. However, Dad left the farm around 1928, had a sale, took whatever he could get for the cattle and horses. My beloved horse was also sold. Then Dad bought a grocery store, with the understanding Mother would go with him. This store was in Scapa. They tried their hand at selling groceries. They wanted me to join them and work in the store, which I did, regretfully leaving my employment, and worked there a few years. Vernon went to school in Scapa. I always enjoyed selling things. People were friendly. I enjoyed meeting new folks and the challenge of doing something new. I remember the old gas pump in front of the store. It had to be pumped up and down by hand to bring up a gallon of gas. I think it was an antique even then. In trade for groceries and supplies, they took in butter and eggs and hides. At first things went well, but times did not improve. A lot of eggs were thrown out the backyard. In trade for groceries and supplies, they took in butter and eggs and hides. At first things went well, but times did not improve. A lot of eggs were thrown out in the backyard, as they felt they could not refuse their old customers in a time of need. They couldn't sell them because there wasn't a market for them. Our living quarters were in the back of the store. I made some good friends there. I'm happy to say that we're all still good friends today. We learned how to play basketball and tennis and went to a few dances and parties. My grandson gave me a clipping which just about sums up living in a small town. It reads as follows. You know you are in a small town when the polka was more popular than the disco on Saturday nights. 3rd Street is on the edge of town. Every sport is played on dirt. The editor of the newspaper carried a camera at all times. You didn't use the car's turn signal because everybody knows where you're going. If you were born on June 13th, your family received a gift for having the New Year's baby. You spoke to all dogs you passed by name, and they wagged at you by name. You dial the wrong number and talk for 15 minutes anyways. You're run off Main Street by a combine. You can't walk for exercise because every car that passes by offers you a ride. You get married and the local paper devotes a quarter of the page to your story. You drive in a ditch 5 miles from town and news gets back before you do. The biggest business in town sells machinery. You write a check on the wrong bank, and it covers you anyway. Pickup trucks on Main Street outnumber cars by 3 to 1. You miss church and receive a get well card. Someone asks you how you are, then listens to what you have to say. Thank God for small towns and people that live in them. How true this is. I'm sorry, folks, but I'm going to cut Beulah's story short here. The story from here gets into her teen years and the life that she lived thereafter with her husband, some of which is personal and pertinent to the family. Know this, though. Beulah became a pioneer businesswoman, opening up her own clothing store, and her husband opened up a hardware store. They would go on to have children of their own, and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. In her later years, once the kids were grown, she traveled widely, saw much of the world, and lived a life of comparative leisure, well earned after the struggles of her youth. It may be that these stories remind you of tales from your grandparents or great-grandparents. If you feel so inspired, please share them down below in the comments. And thank you for listening.